Good evening. My name is Eric Walker, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Orkney International Science Festival and Foraging Fortnight online. The Orkney International Science Festival is having its 30th anniversary this year, and we are marking the occasion with our very first online festival. This year, we are delighted to be bringing a full and diverse festival programme directly to you wherever you are. I'd like to briefly introduce this evening's speaker to you, Ken Duncan. After doing his first brew in the airing cupboard with a Tom Caxton kit from Boots at a young age, Ken was hooked on beer. In 1988, he headed off to Fremantle in Western Australia, where his home brewing enthusiasm was rekindled, and within 3 years was responsible for a garage with over 3,000 bottles and various kegs. His wood-fired beer enterprise came to the attention of a local brewery, where he became brewmaster, brewing beers with the usual malted hops, but also chocolate, bananas, and raspberries. He headed over to Melbourne in 1995, brewing Czech and German Pilsner styles, stouts, and strong ales, before coming back to Scotland in 1997 and joined Inverarmond Brewery in 1999. There, for 20 years, he worked his way up to head brewer. Then Innes and Gunn bought the brewery in 2016, where, fortunately for me, they still brew the excellent golden ale called Ossian. Ken is a Gaelic speaker and sings in Perth Gaelic Choir. He is also a member of the Duke of Athol's private army, the Athol Highlanders, where he is a drummer in their pipe band. In his spare time, he is chair of the Scottish section of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. In his The Botany of Beer talk tonight, he'll tell us how, before hops, beer flavour was balanced by foraged plants and spices. This talk has been organised by the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. If you have any questions or comments for Ken, please enter them in YouTube's live chat. They will then be passed through to here by some ingenious process, and we can discuss them after Ken's talk. Anyway, enough from me. Here is your speaker for today, Ken Duncan, Master Brewer.
That's great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everybody. Welcome to this talk about the Botany of Beer for the 30th Orkney International Science Festival. I'm really chuffed to be here. It's a real privilege. In my day job, apart from being the chair of the Scottish section of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, I am a senior brewer at Williams Brothers Brewing in Alloa, where we're responsible for lots of different kinds of beers with all sorts of flavours and the historic ale series. So it's great fun to be able to make beer, I'll have to say that. I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of a dear friend and enthusiastic supporter of the Orkney International Science Festival and the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, Dr. Tim Dolan. We miss him dearly. As Eric said, I've been brewing beer since I was 15 actually, fermenting in the airing cupboard in old soda bottles. And I've always been fascinated by the flavours of herbs and spices, ever since my father spent every Saturday lunchtime cooking up an Indian-style curry for us children and himself, with mail-order spices, cumin, fenugreek, chili, cloves, coriander, cardamom. And I hope to tell you a little bit about the history of herbs and spices in brewing beer, how it evolved, why, when and whence the botanicals came, and whether herbed and or spiced beer is going to go in the future. I'll also talk a little bit about extant beers flavoured with some of the aforementioned herbs and spices. This year being the year of coasts and waters, I'm pleased to tell you that there is even a beer connection with our coastal waters. Next slide, please. First, I should tell you a little bit about how beer is brewed. It does use a few botanicals, which we call cereal grains and hops. Starting with malted cereal grains, Malting is the process of foreshortened germination of the grain, with the germination halted by a slow heating or kilning. This softens the hard, steely starch inside and allows it to be dissolved easily in hot water. But it leaves the starch inside the grain ready to use for the brewer. Next slide, please. The malt of choice nowadays is usually barley. In the past, it could have been often a mixture or a combination of rye, oats, wheat, as well as barley, mixed or mashed, as we say, with hot water to extract the sugary sweetness or wort. This wort is boiled with the dried flowers of the hop vine to impart its aromatic essential oils and its bittering resins to complement and counter the sweetness of the malty wort. Strained and cooled from the hops, the now bittersweet wort is given a measure of yeast to allow fermentation to occur over the next few days, with the yeast turning the sweetness into alcohol, some fizz, in other words, carbon dioxide, and most important of all, flavour. That's beer in a nutshell. I'll have a pint, please. Now, brewing beer has been around, some say, since the dawn of civilization. It's even been proposed that beer was proof of civilization, as hunter-gatherers began to settle and cultivate crops for the very brewing of beer, and perhaps heretically, that baking bread came as a result of brewing beer. But that's slightly off topic. Next slide, please. And we've got a picture of some hops. A little history lesson now, albeit in a botanical sense. You can see a picture of a young Ken in front of a stand of hops. I was cycling in Czechia about 10 years ago near Zvikov in South Bohemia. And there's a fantastic brew pub there, which is behind me. Once upon a time, in a land far away, well, from Orkney anyway, in ancient Rome, about 50 years into the Common Era, we have the very learned Pliny the Elder, beavering away at his natural histories. He's the first person that we know of today to mention what we think are hops, not actually in a brewing sense, but in an Epicurean sense. He says that the young shoots of this, he called it the lupus salactarius, the wolf willow, are very tasty indeed. Still, this culinary treat exists in Belgium, where the hop is grown and given great respect in the brew house and in the kitchen. In fact, steamed young hop shoots on one's plate can command enormous prices in Michelin star restaurants, as it is seen there as a tremendous delicacy. Moving on to the next slide, we have Hildegard of Bingen. Also moving forward in time to about 1150 in the Common Era. We have the also very learned, the Abbess Hildegard of Bingen near Mainz in Germany, writing in Physica, one of her vast medical and herbal compendia of the hop, the Humulus lupulus, from a brewing and medical perspective. And at a time when few women could read or write, and most were denied a formal, let alone informal education, Hildegard became a legendary healer, visionary, musician, artist, poet, and eventually a saint. Her works included 27 symphonic compositions, a compilation of her visions. That's what you can see coming down onto the top of her head there. She's having a vision and she's writing down what the vision is all about. She wrote her medical compendium and the Physica, which dealt with natural or herbal medicine. Nowadays, these latter writings are quite popular amongst those interested in homeopathic and herbal medicine. In Physica, she was also the first that we know of to describe the preservative qualities of hops, the Humulus lupulus, when added to beer. Nevertheless, she goes on to state that the addition of hops increases melancholy, or the black bile, which was one of Hippocrates' 4 humours of ancient Greek physiology. Now, there's no mention of herbs or spices in, sorry, I just missed a bit there. back a second. Going back further, beyond Pliny and the Romans, we have the ancient Greek early historians, Herodotus and Xenophon. They're mentioning beer, albeit in a passing fashion. Herodotus states that the Egyptians were big in beer, and Xenophon describes the beer of the Scythians as pretty popular in those parts. Although, as the Greeks were wine drinkers themselves, they were somewhat dubious as to its taste. And still further back in time, to Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, which shows the attention given to it then. Not the golden or fizzy froth top delight we know today, but more of a thin porridge with bits in it, demanding the use of a straw to strain out the husks. Now, here we are. There's no mention of herbs or spices in these ancient brews, apart from Hildegard of Bingen's hop additions, but it is reasonable to suggest that local ingredients, such as the cereal grains available, whether barley, beer, as in the ancient barley of Orkney, wheat, emmer, spelt, rye or oats, would have been used to make the brew more flavoursome, or such herbs and spices as were on their doorstep or in the nearby field, or shop, grocer, whatever, trader. I think the important expression here was locally available, because until overland or overseas trade got going in a proper fashion, far-flung herbs and spices would have been impossible to get. Now, this is only my supposition, but I don't have any proof to back it up. On the other hand, we do have plenty of beers that are and have been brewed with local botanicals, though here I'm not counting cereals or hops as botanicals. We have Belgian Kriek with bitter cherries, Frambozen with raspberries, and historical recipes aplenty from the 14th century onwards of a beer style called brewed, which was often brewed with meadowsweet, sage, and yarrow, and probably lots of other herbs as well. Next slide, please. And we can look at what I call the prince of the hedgerows. This is meadowsweet, Philopendula ulmaria. Absolutely gorgeous piece of botany here. I love meadowsweet. One of the earliest pieces of evidence we have for ancient brewing is a fragment of Neolithic pottery found in the island of Rum, which was dated back to about 2,000 years before the Common Era, which contained fermented remnants of yarrow, heather, and meadowsweet. The English botanist John Gerard, in his Herbal, which he published in 1597, goes on to say that meadowsweet was wonderful for strewing upon floors in houses, halls, and chambers in the summertime, for the smell thereof makes the heart merry and joyful, and delighteth the senses. It is glorious stuff, and I love it. I just, I cycle to the shop, cycle into Perth where I live, and I get to go past meadowsweet along the River Almond, and it's wonderful stuff. Next slide, please. And we have sweet Gayle, also known as Miracle Gayle or bog myrtle. And the leaves and flowers, or the little berries really, are used, have been used for generations throughout Europe in ale. It's the most common herb after juniper for brewing in the old world, as the leaves are bitter and they have very antiseptic qualities, similar to hops in fact, and they're very, very flavored. They're almost balsamic in flavor with a very spicy aroma. Well valued in medieval times for its use in ale, and even in Norway in the 14th century, there's a legal text that states it could be used as payment for farm rents, and that moors where it was gathered were then apportioned to that gathering farm. So it was valuable stuff. Next slide, please. And we shall have a look at sage, Salvia officinalis, used for millennia as a healing plant. Salvia comes from the Latin to save or salve or cure almost. It's very antibacterial. Several compounds are effective against Candida albans, E. coli species, Klebsiella pneumoniae, which are all implicated in a UTI, which is a terrible thing, urinary tract infections. I've spelt inflections in my script here, probably just as bad. Also very effective against that hospital horror, Staphylococcus aureus, what everyone in the nursing and doctor trade knows as the golden staph. Tea and powdered sage is good for skin infections, gingivitis and tonsillitis. I mean, it's a veritable wonder drug of a plant. And there's an old Latin tag, cur homo moriatur cui salvia in horto crescit. Why should a man die whilst sage grows in his garden? And the lovely thing about sage is it's so tasty too. It's a distant cousin of the dangerous wormwood, being in the Artemisia clan, but with far less of the thujone, the supposedly active ingredient therein. Leaves and florets are fantastic in the brew. Wonderful thing about sage in one's garden is that it's just, you can use it in anything. I love doing it with chestnuts and rice and garlic, and brilliant. But in beer, it gives a real spicy character. Now, there weren't any hops in Gruit, but plenty of flavors from the leaves and flowers of these botanicals. The Gruit style has had a resurgence in recent times, with the craft beer community bringing out Gruit after Gruit. We love brewing old styles of beer, with or without a modern twist. Sometimes there is heather in Gruit, but the main thing to remember here is that there aren't any rules, and I suspect, were there ever any rules, as folk brewed what they could with what they had. For example, if the barley and wheat crop had been rubbish and failed, as it often did in those days, crop failure, common. But the oats had come through, then one would do a brew, if you had oats to spare, with oats and only the oats. It might not be a classic, and people perhaps, did they hark back to the winter of 76? Not 1976, but 1576, and say, oh, remember that cracking ale from that oat ale from 76? But the question is now, was any brew replicable taste-wise? For today, we concentrate so much on looking for consistency from brew to brew. But back in the olden days, things are different. Next slide, please. And we should have heather ale. No, not heather ale. We've actually got heather. We've got ling heather, Calluna vulgaris, being picked by a young Bruce Williams in his plaid on Sheriff Muir. And it's quite good stuff, this heather ale. Fruch in Gaelic, that means heather. And I'm just trying to make this work a little bit. Sorry, just 2 seconds. I think we're okay now. Hang on. Seems to have stuck. Sorry for this, 2 seconds. That's it. So, Fruch, heather ale, brewed with heather tips. 7 big sacks of them in about 35 barrels of wort. That's, what, 50 hectolitres. And boiled up with 3 huge bags of sweet Gayle. I mean, it's wonderfully aromatic with the fresh taste of the moor. I was helping the lads at the brew kettle, pulling out the heather tips. The last time we brewed this a couple of weeks ago. We talk about blooming heather. This was blooming, heathery hard work, but the aroma was amazing. Next slide, please. And we should have some pine tips and some spruce tips. And this is, these were often used in the olden days. In fact, when the first settlers went to the United States, they brewed spruce ale because that's all they could find. But spruce, really lovely. The tips, the young green tips, the green fly, They love them, and no wonder, because they're just full of beautifully sweet, spicy sap. And they're fantastic for brewing another historic ale, spruce ale. Williams Brothers, not to mention them again, they do a beer called Alapa, spelt Alba, but in Gaelic we pronounce it Alapa. Next slide, please, and we'll have a look at some juniper. Now, Eric's already mentioned my special relationship with juniper. You're thinking he likes his gin. Well, I do. But juniper is the clan badge of the Murrays. And as a lover of Murray mints, and also as an Atholl Highlander, the Duke of Murray's private army, I get to wear a sprig of juniper in my Glengarry on my head. In fact, when we join, the Duke personally gives us our juniper sprig for our bonnet. But in the Nordic lands, there are many long-standing traditions of brewing juniper beers with juniper twigs and berries in the mash tun with a pronounced juniper taste, known as sahti in Finland. This type of farmhouse ale has given the brewing world the wooden yeast log, in other words, a little piece of wood like this that you would put in the brew, and you would take it out at the end and it would be covered in yeast, and you'd use it for the next brew. There's also a kind of yeast which is now very popular called kveik. It's the Norwegian name of one of these types of farmhouse yeast, or probably types of farmhouse yeasts. I suspect they're quite a lot of yeasts. They're very popular now amongst craft brewers for their very fast, and I mean fast, 36 hours, very high temperature, maybe 34 degrees fermentations. That's 34 Celsius fermentations with, very oddly enough, very low esters. They're the fruity flavors we have in beer, the part that yeast provide. Next slide, please. And we look at the elder. It's Sambuca nigra, or Sambucus nigris, the elder tree, said to be imbued with magical properties. Offers up its flowers and berries in two differing ways. The flowers can be boiled up in the kettle with the wort for their essential oils, or the black berries can be crushed and added to the fermented beer for their rich sweetness and colour. And the elder is full of goodness and more antibacterial properties as well, and is a full-on pharmacy, according to the herbalists. Now, we've heard of elderflower cordial, so why not elderflower ale? Sweet, aromatic, creamy white elderflowers added late in the boil to impart their delicacy and rose-like scent into the wort. And there's plenty if you look. There's a few from a brewery in Alloa. Next slide, please. And we should have some elderberries themselves, along with a beer called ebullium. Ebullium was the traditional name for this kind of elderberry, strong, dark, malty brew, which was infused with elderberries. And there's loads of ways of doing it. You could put them in the kettle, you could put them in the fermenter, you could put them in the barrel. There were no right or wrong way of doing it. One brewing manual written in the 1600s talks about putting the elderberries into a cask, hogshead shape, hogshead size, and putting about 6 gallons of elderberries into the cask through the bung, putting the beer in and letting it sit for a year. Would be absolutely fascinating to try that nowadays. And it's a lovely beer. It's rich. It's the elderberries, they're fantastic. Just to pick them, by the roadside or by where there's an elder tree, and they grow everywhere in Scotland, really. And pick the berries, just eat them. You'll be covered in juice. It's great. Don't wear a white shirt. Next slide, please. There we go. And we've got some rockweed kelp, Ascophyllum nodosa. In Gaelic, we call it Femine Vuia, which means yellow kelp. It has various names: Norwegian kelp, knotted kelp, knotted or egg rack, and it's a beer that Williams Brothers brew. It's a nod to the crofters on the coast who would dig seaweed into the land to fertilize it. If you've got poor quality land, seaweed, it's fantastic stuff. Dig it in and it'll help you get a better crop next year, because it's all about what you can get off the land. The kelp actually adds a luscious richness to this dark chocolatey ale. Really nice stuff. One thing which these Northern European brews have in common is they tend to have been made with flowers or the leaves of woody or herbaceous plants that we generally don't call spices. Now, one of the questions I have in my head is, why do we have this differentiation between herbs and spices? Not really sure. We can discuss that later on, I suspect. Is it spices come from far away, herbs are local? Maybe. Next slide, please, and we'll have a little look at a spice rack. And going back to my father's obsession with spices, I thought it normal in the late 60s, because I'm only a young guy, for ordinary Scottish families to partake of a spicy curry for Saturday lunch at home. It wasn't until he mentioned when I was much older, probably in my teens, that he'd been in a Highland regiment in the war, in World War II, in a brigade with Gurkhas and Sikhs. And it was the tasting of their spicy foods that had left such a lasting impression upon him that he wanted to recreate it at home with us youngsters. Now, his desire for the wonders of spices with their depth and breadth of flavour wasn't a new phenomenon. It's been around since spices were discovered by people. And my father's spice hobby originated from his time in Southeast Asia, Burma as it then was called, and Indonesia and Malaysia, the heartland of the spice world. I was looking up where the Spice Islands were, the Moluccas, and they're in sort of northeast of, I was going to say Krakatoa, east of Java, but Krakatoa is actually west of Java, but it's around that part of the world, south of the Philippines, nestled by Irian Java and Timor, and these islands in there. Incredible. But what we're looking at, of course, is the spice world through a European lens. But that said, between the 12th and 17th centuries, it was really the trade in black pepper, with the other spices hanging on pepper's coattails, that made the Oriental spice trade incredibly profitable but dynamic element in European trade. There always had been some trade between Europe and the Middle East, from Egypt to the Pharaohs, the maritime ancient Greeks, the city-states, Alexander the Great's Greater Macedonian Empire, and the vast lands under the sway of ancient Rome. They all had their trade routes with the East. Overland routes were the beginning of all this, such as the Silk Road, what became the Byzantine Empire, and the maritime Italian city-states of Genoa and Venice, controlling the trade until the 15th century. But it was the opening up of maritime routes that enabled the spice trade to grow exponentially. And the spur for this was the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to I think it was the Ottoman Empire, or was it the Seljuk Empire? I'm not quite sure. And they took charge of the spice trade to the west and duly charged, because it's all about money, high duty rates on such goods passing through its lands. In other words, Constantinople. The Western Christian nations then sought out alternative routes to the spice world to bypass Ottoman taxes. And it was the Portuguese who first found a route the long way down around Africa to the east, led by Vasco da Gama, who was the first to sail around Africa to Calicut in southwest India. And then he went on, and the Portuguese then went on to dominate the trade, followed by the Spanish, which is why the Philippines became Spanish originally. Christopher Columbus was actually heading west to discover a new route to Spiceland. Sir Francis Drake even got one in for Merry England with his ship, the Golden Hind, returning from the Moluccas to Plymouth after a 2-year voyage in 1580 with a huge cargo of cloves. The Dutch made their mark with the founding of the Dutch East India Company in 1600 with great success, which changed the fortunes of their land for 150 years. But the different nations were all doing, what they were all doing was really cutting out the middlemen, from the Spice Islands to the Thai coast or the Indonesian coast, and then the next lot taking their margin and their margin and their margin. So spice was very expensive when it came over to the European part of the world. Going direct to source, but keeping the margins for themselves. A good insight of the growth of the Venetian spice trade, for example, is to be had by reading Dorothy Dunnett's series of historical novels about the House of Niccolo, well researched and thoroughly entertaining. So what were these spices that were sought after? The 4 main spices are black pepper. So next slide, please. And we'll have a look at some piper nigrum, black pepper. Oh, here it looks green. And you have these long strands of green peppercorns. And black pepper, this pepper bush, for example, will provide green pepper, white pepper, black pepper, and red pepper, depending what stage the actual seed has matured. But black pepper was the king of the trade. It was in the 1590s, for example, Venice was bringing in 500 tons a year from Alexandria via the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and then over to the east, or from the east. And at the same time, Portugal was bringing in 2,000 tons a year. Huge business. It's still the largest portion of the spice trade today. $4 billion per annum for 750,000 tons of black pepper. Beers with black pepper, Bateman's Black Pepper Ale. It won a gold medal at the World Beer Awards in 2014. It was spicy, black, and delicious. And my favorite line about it was the marketing line. It went, "It's all in the pepperation," which I thought was brilliant. Next slide, please. And we can have a look at some ginger. And Zingiber officinale, another spice. It's actually the rhizome. It's the bottom of the, it's the roots. They're not really roots. It's a rhizome, which is not known in the wild. It's purely cultivated for its crop. Known again since the ancient times. Global market, 2.8 million tons nowadays. India is the largest producer. When the leaves start to die back, the rhizome's dug up, washed, and scalded to prevent it growing. So little chance of planting it in the raised bed in the hope of a crop. There's plenty of beers with ginger, let alone ginger beer. You can see the ginger from a brewery in Alloa. Now, for that one, we use 100 kilos. That's half a pallet of ginger root, which we chop up and then throw into the brew kettle to get its warmth and zing. And I've wondered for a long time, does the expression zing come from the name of ginger, Zingiber? Midnight Sun, another beer there. That's a rich black chocolatey porter with a ginger finish. So it's got quite a heat. Ginger has heat as well as the depth of spice. Next slide. It's cinnamon. And we've got Cinnamomum verum, real cinnamon or true cinnamon. It's a typical Christmas ale spice. The inner bark of the cinnamon tree. The cinnamon you see on the screen there, the little cinnamon little rolls of cinnamon sticks. That's the Sri Lankan variety. Very fine and with a really lovely aroma. There is also cassia, which is another type of cinnamon, generally from China, and it has a much thicker bark and isn't so aromatic. But It's really good for all sorts of things. I used to brew a beer at Inverarmond called Santa's Swally, a Christmas ale with 5 kilos of cinnamon sticks and a kilo of nutmeg crushed up to give the beer its spicy warmth. There's no shortage of cinnamon beers these days, especially in the US. They generally tend to be Halloween style beers with pumpkin and cinnamon. And then the final spice is clove. Next slide, please. And we've got Syzygium aromaticum. Syzygium from the ancient Greek su, meaning together, or with, and zygium meaning a yolk, so it's joined together. I don't quite know what that means botanically, but it's obviously very important. Aromaticum, well, we know what that means. I can't think of many beers with cloves in them. I used to brew a beer in Australia called Redback, which is named after a spider, which tasted of cloves and banana. But the clove flavour came from the yeast we were using, a German-style wheat beer with a phenolic yeast character of clove. And that produced something called 4-vinyl guaiacol, which is a cracking clove character. And the bananas came from a flavour the yeast produced called isoamyl acetate, which is banana. But it's really lovely beer. German-style wheat beers, amazing stuff. There's plenty of other spices. Nutmeg, mace, its covering, cardamom, vanilla, cumin, turmeric, galangal, so on. You could go on for days. I've not mentioned coriander. Coriander is it a spice or a herb? Coriander seeds are spice, but the leaves as herbs. I wonder. Native to Italy, Southern Europe, now grown pretty much all over Central Asia and further east. Is it exotic? But is that part of the original definition of spice? Not sure. There's plenty of beers brewed with coriander as the seed. Belgian wheat beer or wit beer, Hildegard, for example. Another great example is Blanche de Nemours from the Brasserie du Boc in southern Belgium. A really nice brewery. There's also the brewery Lowlander from the Netherlands. They do some fantastic spice beers, and they take their inspiration from the spice trade. There's been a lot of talk from me, so I'm going to pour myself a beer. So just one moment. I'm just going to do this. Pour myself a heather ale. There we go. To contemplate and consider the spices and herbs that people have been using for countless generations. So to finish up, we've had a look at herbs and spices, albeit only a small snapshot of what there is actually out there. Historically, the botany in beer was about what was available, but on our global world of instantaneous acquisition and gratification, we can brew beer with just about anything grown anywhere. Whether it's desirable to drink, that's another question, and not for me to answer. All I would say is if it tastes good, brew it. Love your beer and be nice a lot. And could we have the next slide, the last slide, please? And thanks very much to Howie Firth for giving me the opportunity to speak, and to Eric Walker and the hard-working team behind the scenes for making it work for you. Thanks very much. Slanjiva.
Skål, Ken.
Skål.
Ken, what a fantastic talk. I'll tell you, I get the feeling you probably could have talked about quite a lot of subjects associated with us tonight. As it is, we're coming up for a bit of time, so we're going to be very limited in any of the questions.
Sorry about that.
It's all right, man. No problem. Apart from the flavour, is there any other reason botanicals were used in the brewing process, and if they were, what stages of the process are they actually added at?
Well, I think the real question is why they were being used, as you say. Medicinal, perhaps, and preservative. Sage, for example, elderflower leaves, they give, and juniper, they are antiseptic. They prevent a lot of bacteria growing, so they could be used as a preservative. They're not as good, perhaps, as hops became, and I think that's the real reason that hops took over from herbs and spices over the generations. in around the sort of 1600s. That was the sort of the turnover part. But preservative, some people talk about the medicinal qualities of some of the botanicals, but I think that was people just exploring what medicine was all about, let alone what flavor was all about. I think people really just brewed it. They would use what worked. You know, people were very practical in the olden days.
Yeah. Actually, I've got a comment from a Gary Eisenhower. He's actually said, Kelpie seaweed ale was a favourite of mine, but folks looked at me funny for drinking it. And I get where he's coming from, because some of the modern brews with, the different preservatives and flavours, they do look hazy and they've got a different mouthfeel than what I was brought up with, the fizzy, clear ales of the 70s,
Yeah, exactly, and there's no right or wrong about these things. And every taste can be a new taste. It might be a great experience, it might not be a great experience. But I think it's always good to challenge one's taste buds and try new things. You might not like it, but you might. You never know.
Yeah. Asking about the heather, like the spruce, you said it was the tips they used. Is it only the tips of the heather that are used as well?
Yes, it is. Although heather, if you're cutting a sprig of heather, you're not just getting that little bit there. You tend to get a twig, shall we say, or a hat. That's about a handful.
Yeah.
Might be a handful or a couple of fingers. Those fingers. Let's try those two for a change. Nanu. And it's really the florets, the little bells. They're the ones that have the aromatic essential oils. The woody parts don't really contribute much at all. But you can't really pick 1,000 or 20,000 little flowers unless you're sort of Tinkerbell size. But it's always the young shoots of everything have all the energy of the plant, that life force, and that's what we're trying to capture, I suppose, by putting in the beer.
Yeah. Here's one about it's probably about trade control in a way. Thinking of the German laws on beer ingredients, the Reinheitsgebot. When did the use of botanicals become less acceptable in brewing, and why was that?
That really happened, I suppose, in the sort of 1600s. The grouped brewers, most people were brewing these herb beers. Hops came through, and there was a move. It was all based around money. It's all about tax, because the thing about the German beer purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, is that Wilhelm II of Bavaria saying you can only brew beer with malt, hops, and water. He didn't know about yeast in those days. That got added on later on, and then he put a tax on malt. So it's all about tax raising and control. With the herbs, people could there wasn't any tax on the group beer as such. But when hops started to be used, the brewers thought the more industrial, with a more industrial bent, shall we say. Industrial is the wrong word, because it was large cottage or craft in that sense. They thought that hops are better because there's better preservative qualities. It allows beer to travel. I'm not talking about hundreds of miles. It could travel to the next village, and you could sell your beer in larger quantity, and in further afield to the next village and the town beyond that, for example. Yeah. And that's when that happened. That's the switch, and it really came from people wanting to control tax revenues.
Okay, and one last one. So that was looking into the past, into history. Looking into the future, how do you imagine the availability of your favourite ingredients are going to be affected by climate change?
Very interesting, because hops, for example, barley. We don't know. The Egyptians were brewing beer, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Were they using barley? We think they were. The climate was different then, so the climate, will change. But I still think we'll be able to get barley and wheat and oats, the main cereals. But hops, that's going to be more interesting because they're very, it's a tight band of around the planet where they can grow. And they want water, and they want the right temperature. They don't want it too hot. They don't want it too cold. A bit like us, they're a bit fussy. I live in hope. I'm an eternal optimist, put it that way.
Well, it's great to be an optimist and a beer drinker, of course. Ken, that's been a most interesting presentation and the discussion as well. And there's so much more. There's comments and questions that have been asked. We're going to send them to you so you can answer them at your leisure, and we'll append them to the festival website at some later date. Anyway, thank you so much for giving us your time, your knowledge, your experience. And can I also thank the audience for participating? And a very big thank you to our technical team for making this all happen.
No, thank you indeed.
Okay, I'm just cheers, Ken. Absolutely cheers. And I'm just going to remind you and everyone else to join tonight's Festival Club table session. That's our little after-event pub. It's great fun, great crack, and I'd love to see you there. So from me, Ken, everyone behind the scenes, good evening and goodbye for now.